Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when no one is looking. In a world where every royal gesture is scrutinized, photographed, and analyzed, there exists a rare magic in the unguarded seconds that reveal the true essence of who someone really is. What happened on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in London would remind an entire nation why they fell in love with their future king and queen in the first place. It wasn't a grand ceremony, a state dinner, or a carefully orchestrated public appearance. It wasn't captured by the official palace photographers or planned by a team of advisors. Instead, it was a fleeting moment that a single passerby witnessed through a rain-streaked window, a moment so genuine and profound that it would ripple through social media, news outlets, and dinner conversations across the globe within hours. In an age of carefully curated public images and calculated royal duties, this story is about the power of authenticity. It's about two people who, despite carrying the weight of a monarchy on their shoulders, managed to show the world that beneath the titles and tiaras, they remain beautifully, remarkably human. What you're about to read isn't just another royal story. It's a reminder that the most meaningful connections happen not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when we think no one is watching. And sometimes those are exactly the moments that matter most. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of the small cafe on Kensington High Street, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the bustling London morning. Sarah Chun had claimed her usual corner table, laptop open, steam rising from her untouched coffee as she struggled to meet her deadline for the local community newsletter. As a freelance writer who specialized in neighborhood stories, she had learned to find inspiration in the most mundane moments of daily life. Outside, the October morning carried that particular London chill that made people hurry past with their collars turned up and umbrellas clutched tightly. Sarah barely glanced up from her screen until a commotion across the street caught her attention. Two black Range Rovers had pulled up outside the small independent bookstore that had been struggling to stay afloat since the pandemic. She recognized the vehicles immediately, though she could hardly believe what she was seeing. Prince William emerged first, his tall frame unmistakable even in casual clothes. He wore a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, looking more like any other father running weekend errands than the heir to the British throne. But it was Catherine who made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The Princess of Wales stepped out of the second vehicle, and even from across the street, there was something different about her demeanor that morning. Catherine had always carried herself with grace, but today there seemed to be a lightness in her step that hadn't been there during recent public appearances. She wore a cream-colored coat that Sarah recognized from previous royal engagements, but she'd paired it with simple dark jeans and ankle boots. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she carried a canvas tote bag instead of her usual structured handbag. What struck Sarah most was how they moved together. There were no bodyguards creating barriers, no photographers documenting their every step, no rigid protocol dictating their behavior. They simply walked hand in hand toward the bookstore like any other couple, pausing occasionally to point out something in a shop window or share a quiet laugh. The bookstore, Chapters and Stories, had been a fixture in the neighborhood for over 30 years. Its elderly owner, Mrs. Margaret Whitfield, had been battling rising rents and declining foot traffic. Sarah had written several pieces about local businesses struggling in the post-pandemic economy, and Mrs. Whitfield's story had particularly touched her. The woman had dedicated her life to fostering a love of reading in the community, hosting children's story hours, book clubs for seniors, and poetry nights that brought neighbors together. Through the rain-streaked window, Sarah watched as William and Catherine approached the shop. They paused outside, reading the small sign in the window that advertised the upcoming closure sale. Catherine's expression changed, a look of genuine sadness crossing her features. She turned to William, and, even without being able to hear their conversation, Sarah could see the intensity of their discussion. What happened next would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. Instead of making a token appearance or having their staff arrange a formal visit later, William and Catherine simply pushed open the door and stepped inside. There was no fanfare, No announcement, just two people walking into a neighborhood bookstore on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sarah abandoned her laptop and rushed to get a better view, positioning herself at the cafe window. Other patrons had begun to notice the unusual activity, and soon several people had gathered, phones in hand, trying to capture the unexpected royal visit. But something about the scene made them lower their devices. Perhaps it was the intimacy of the moment, or the sense that they were witnessing something genuinely special rather than a photo opportunity. Inside the bookstore, Mrs. Whitfield's face was a picture of shock and delight. Sarah could see her gesturing animatedly, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke to the royal couple. William and Catherine listened intently, their body language conveying genuine interest and concern. They weren't rushing through the interaction or looking for an exit strategy. They were simply present, fully engaged in whatever Mrs. Whitfield was telling them. Catherine picked up a children's book from a nearby display, showing it to William. They exchanged a look that spoke of shared memories, perhaps thinking of their own children and the countless bedtime stories they'd shared. William nodded and said something that made Catherine laugh, the sound audible even through the glass that separated them from the small crowd that had gathered outside. Mrs. Whitfield led them deeper into the store, pointing out different sections and sharing stories about regular customers and their favorite books. Catherine paused at the local authors section, examining several titles while William engaged Mrs. Whitfield in what appeared to be a serious conversation. Their faces were earnest, focused, as if they were discussing something important rather than making polite small talk. The intimacy of the scene was remarkable. Here were two of the most photographed people in the world, yet they seemed completely unaware of the attention they were attracting. They moved through the narrow aisles with the familiarity of people who genuinely loved books, stopping to read back covers, sharing recommendations with each other, and with Mrs. Whitfield. At one point, Catherine crouched down to examine the children's section, running her fingers along the spines of picture books with the reverence of someone who understood their importance. William joined her, and they spent several minutes selecting books, their heads bent close together as they discussed their choices. There was something profoundly moving about watching them in this unguarded moment, seeing them not as royal figures, but as parents who cared about fostering a love of reading in their children. Mrs. Whitfield disappeared into the back room and returned with a photo album. Sarah watched as she showed the royal couple pictures that appeared to span decades of the bookstore's history. There were images of children at story time, elderly customers at book club meetings, local authors giving readings, and community events that had brought neighbors together. Catherine's hand went to her heart at one point, clearly moved by what she was seeing. The conversation grew more animated, and Sarah could see William taking notes on his phone. They weren't just browsing, they were planning something. The intensity of their discussion suggested this wasn't a casual visit, but the beginning of something more significant. Catherine kept gesturing toward different areas of the store, her excitement evident even from a distance. As their visit continued, word spread through the neighborhood. More people began gathering outside, but there was a respectful quality to the crowd that had formed. These weren't tourists hoping for a photo. They were neighbors who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Many of them were regular customers of the bookstore, people who had attended Mrs. Whitfield's events and knew how much the shop meant to the community. Sarah noticed an elderly man with a walking stick standing at the edge of the crowd. She recognized him as Mr. James Patterson, a retired teacher who came to the poetry nights every Thursday. He wasn't trying to take pictures or push forward for a better view. Instead, he simply stood quietly, a small smile on his face, as if he were witnessing exactly what he had hoped might happen when he heard about the bookstore's impending closure. Inside the shop, the conversation had taken on an even more serious tone. William was now making what appeared to be phone calls, stepping slightly away while speaking intently into his device. Catherine continued her conversation with Mrs. Whitfield, and Sarah could see the older woman's eyes filling with tears. But these weren't tears of sadness. There was a hopefulness in her expression that hadn't been there when Sarah had interviewed her the previous month. The rain continued to fall, but nobody in the gathered crowd seemed to mind. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something important was happening. Children pressed their faces against the bookstore window, their breath fogging the glass as they tried to get a glimpse inside. Parents lifted toddlers onto their shoulders, pointing out the royal visitors with quiet excitement. What struck Sarah most was the genuine nature of the interaction she was witnessing. This wasn't a staged photo opportunity or a carefully managed royal engagement. William and Catherine had simply seen a need in their community and had chosen to respond immediately and personally. There was no advance team, no press releases, no carefully crafted statements. Just two people who cared enough to stop and listen and try to help. As their visit stretched into its second hour, the crowd outside had grown larger, but remained respectful. Local shop owners had come out to witness the unprecedented scene. The baker from next door stood in his flour-dusted apron. The florist clutched a small bouquet she had hastily assembled, and the cafe owner had brought out complimentary umbrellas for those still standing in the rain. The sense of community that surrounded the bookstore that morning was palpable. Neighbors who might normally hurry past each other on their way to work were now standing together, sharing stories about Mrs. Whitfield and the role her bookstore had played in their lives. Children who had attended story time were recounting their favorite books, while elderly customers shared memories of book club discussions that had sparked lifelong friendships. Through it all, William and Catherine remained focused on their conversation with Mrs. Whitfield, seemingly oblivious to the crowd that had gathered to watch them. Their attention never wavered from the woman who had dedicated her life to serving her community through books and stories. They listened with the kind of focus usually reserved for matters of state, treating her concerns with the gravity and respect they deserved. As the morning progressed, Sarah realized she was witnessing something truly extraordinary. In a world where royal visits are typically orchestrated months in advance, and every detail is carefully planned, this spontaneous show of support felt revolutionary. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful gestures are the ones that come from the heart rather than from a protocol manual. The quiet moment unfolding in the little bookstore on Kensington High Street would soon capture the attention of the entire nation. But for now, it remained an intimate scene of two people using their privilege and platform to make a difference in one person's life, one community at a time. Inside the warmth of chapters and stories, Margaret Whitfield's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from her thermos into 3 mismatched mugs she kept behind the counter. At 78 years old, she had owned the bookstore for over 4 decades, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this moment. The Prince and Princess of Wales sat across from her at the small table she usually reserved for intimate book discussions, their attention focused entirely on her story. "I never imagined it would come to this," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When my husband George and I opened this place in 1982, we thought we'd run it until we were too old to climb the ladder to reach the top shelves." She gestured toward the tall bookcases that lined the narrow shop, their shelves packed with everything from classic literature to contemporary fiction, from children's picture books to poetry collections. Catherine leaned forward, her dark eyes filled with genuine concern. "Tell us what happened, Mrs. Whitfield. We want to understand everything." Margaret's weathered hands wrapped around her mug as she began to explain. The story that unfolded was one that had become all too common in post-pandemic London. Rising commercial rents, increased utility costs, and changing reading habits had created a perfect storm that threatened small independent businesses like hers. Online retailers had captured much of her customer base, and the 2-year period of lockdowns had depleted her savings. "The landlord gave me notice 6 months ago," Margaret continued. "He wants to convert the space into luxury flats. I can't compete with the money developers are offering." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke. "I've tried everything. I applied for grants, started online sales, even considered selling my own home to keep this place running. But it's not enough." William set down his mug and pulled out his phone, making notes as Margaret spoke. "How many people does the bookstore serve regularly?" he asked. "Well," Margaret brightened slightly, We have about 300 regular customers. The children's story time brings in 20 to 30 families every Saturday morning. Our book club has been meeting here for 15 years, and we have 12 members who become like family to me. The poetry nights draw 20 to 30 people on Thursday evenings, including some wonderfully talented local writers who've never had another venue to share their work. Catherine's expression grew more determined with each detail Margaret shared. These aren't just programs, she said to William. They're the fabric that holds this community together. Margaret nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Mrs. Chun from the cafe down the street met her husband at one of our book club meetings. Little Tommy Morrison learned to read here when he was struggling in school. His mother says this place saved his academic future. And Mr. Patterson, the retired teacher who comes to poetry nights, tells me this is the only social interaction he has since his wife passed away. The conversation was interrupted briefly when a young woman entered the shop, her 4-year-old daughter in tow. The child immediately ran to the picture book section, clearly familiar with the layout of the store. The mother froze when she recognized the royal visitors, but Catherine immediately stood and approached them with a warm smile. "Please, don't let us disturb your visit," Catherine said gently. "We're just having a chat with Mrs. Whitfield." The little girl, oblivious to the significance of the moment, tugged on Catherine's coat. "Are you here for story time? Mrs. Maggie reads the best stories." Catherine crouched down to the child's eye level. "I bet she does. What's your favorite book here?" The girl dragged Catherine toward a display of picture books, chattering excitedly about a story involving a princess and a dragon. William watched with amusement as his wife was given an impromptu tour of the children's section by an enthusiastic 4-year-old guide. The mother approached Margaret hesitantly. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. We just came by to pick up the books I ordered for Emma's birthday party." "Of course, dear," Margaret said, rising to retrieve a bag from behind the counter. "I wrapped them specially, just as you asked." As the mother paid for her purchase, she couldn't help but glance toward William. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said quietly, "I hope you know how much this place means to all of us. Emma asks to come here every week. She says the books here are magic." William stood and walked over to where Catherine was still engaged in conversation with little Emma about her favorite stories. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "would you mind if we asked you some specific questions about the economics of running this place?" For the next hour, the conversation delved into the practical realities of independent bookselling. Margaret pulled out ledgers and financial statements, walking them through the challenges she faced. The rent had increased by 40% over the past 5 years, while her sales had remained relatively stable, but not enough to cover the rising costs. "I'm not asking for charity," Margaret emphasized. "I've always believed in earning my way, but the economics have become impossible for small businesses like mine." William studied the numbers carefully. "What would it take to keep you operating here for another decade?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I've done the calculations 1,000 times. If I could get some help with the initial rent increase, maybe find a way to expand my online presence, and perhaps create some additional revenue streams, I think we can make it work." Catherine had been quietly observing the bookstore while they talked, noting every detail. "Mrs. Whitfield, have you ever considered hosting larger community events? Author readings, literary festivals, educational workshops?" "I've always wanted to," Margaret replied, "but I don't have the space or the resources to market them properly. This has always been a grassroots operation." "What if that changed?" William asked. "What if you had support to expand your programming and reach a wider audience?" Margaret looked between the two royal visitors, hardly daring to hope. "You really think that could work?" Catherine's phone had been buzzing periodically throughout their conversation, but she had ignored it completely. Now she glanced at it briefly and showed the screen to William. Social media posts about their visit were already beginning to appear, but rather than looking concerned, they both seemed pleased. "Mrs. Whitfield," Catherine said, "we'd like to propose something, but we want to make sure it's something you'd be comfortable with." Margaret nodded eagerly. "What if we help you turn this into a model for community-based independent bookstores? Not just saving your store, but creating a template that other struggling bookstores could use." William continued the thought. We have access to resources, connections with publishers, relationships with literacy organizations. But more importantly, we have a platform that could bring attention to the vital role that independent bookstores play in building and maintaining community connections. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. You would do that? We'd love to, Catherine said warmly. But only if it's something you want. This would mean more attention, more visitors, potentially more pressure. We want to help, but not in a way that changes the essential character of what you've built here. The older woman was quiet for several minutes, clearly overwhelmed by the possibilities. Finally, she spoke. When George and I started this place, our dream was to create a space where books could bring people together. If you think we can save not just this bookstore, but help other communities create similar spaces, then yes, absolutely yes. William was already making more phone calls, speaking quietly but intently with someone about legal matters and logistics. Catherine continued her conversation with Margaret, diving deeper into her vision for expanded programming and community outreach. We could host school groups, Margaret said, her excitement growing. Literacy workshops for adults who struggle with reading. Writing groups for aspiring authors. Perhaps even partner with local schools to create reading mentorship programs. What about author events? Catherine suggested. We could help you connect with established writers who would be honored to support a bookstore with such a strong community focus. Margaret's entire demeanor had transformed. The worried, defeated woman who had poured tea an hour earlier was now animated and enthusiastic, her mind racing with possibilities. We could create a proper website, maybe even offer book subscriptions for people who want to support local independent stores but can't always visit in person. As their planning session continued, more customers entered the store. Word was clearly spreading through the neighborhood about the royal visit. But each person who came in was greeted by Margaret with her usual warmth and personal attention. Catherine and William observed how she knew each customer by name, remembered their reading preferences, and often had specific recommendations waiting for them. One elderly gentleman entered using a walker, and Margaret immediately went to assist him. "Mr. Thompson," she said cheerfully, "I have that biography you ordered, and I think you'll love the new mystery series that just came in." The man's face lit up when he saw her. "Margaret, my dear, you're the highlight of my week." He glanced curiously at William and Catherine, but was too polite to stare. Catherine approached him gently. "Are you a regular here, Mr. Thompson?" "Oh, yes," he replied with a smile. "I've been coming here for 20 years. Lost my wife 3 years ago, and I don't know what I would have done without this place and Margaret's friendship. She always has time to chat about books, and she's introduced me to so many wonderful stories that have helped me through difficult times." William exchanged a meaningful look with Catherine. This was exactly what they had suspected, but hearing it confirmed by actual customers made their decision to help even more certain. As the afternoon progressed, the bookstore filled with a steady stream of neighbors who had heard about the royal visit. But what could have been a chaotic scene remained remarkably civilized. Perhaps it was Margaret's calming presence, or perhaps it was the genuine nature of the conversation they were witnessing, but everyone who entered seemed to understand that they were participating in something special. A local teacher brought her entire class for an impromptu field trip. The children were thrilled to meet real royalty, but they were even more excited to share their favorite books with Catherine and William. The royal couple spent nearly 30 minutes sitting on the floor with the children, listening to their animated descriptions of stories and characters. "This," Catherine whispered to William as a 6-year-old explained the plot of his favorite adventure book, "is exactly why places like this matter." By the time the afternoon light began to fade, the small bookstore had hosted more visitors in one day than it typically saw in a week. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, Margaret seemed energized by the activity and the sense of possibility that now filled her shop. The quiet conversation that had begun that morning had evolved into something much larger and more significant. What started as a spontaneous visit to a struggling bookstore had become the foundation for a community revitalization project that would extend far beyond the walls of chapters and stories. The BY evening, The impromptu royal visit had transformed from a quiet moment into a phenomenon that was capturing hearts across the nation. Sarah Chun had abandoned her original deadline entirely, instead documenting what she was witnessing through the cafe window. Her social media posts about the genuine connection she observed between William, Catherine, and Mrs. Whitfield have been shared thousands of times within hours. But inside the bookstore, the focus remained intensely personal and practical. As the last of the afternoon customers left, William, Catherine, and Margaret settled into what had become an impromptu strategy session. The table was now covered with notebooks, financial documents, and Margaret's well-worn address book filled with contact from 4 decades in the book business. "Let me be completely honest with you," William said, his tone shifting to something more formal, but no less warm. "Catherine, and I can't simply write a check and solve this problem. That's not how sustainable change happens, and it's not what you need." Margaret nodded, though she looked slightly confused. "Understand, Your Royal Highness. I never expected." "Please," Catherine interrupted gently, "call us William and Catherine. And what my husband means is that we want to help in a way that creates lasting change, not just a temporary fix." William pulled out his phone and showed Margaret a series of notes he had been taking throughout the day. "We've been thinking about this as we've talked with you and observed how this place operates. What you have here isn't just a bookstore. It's a community center that happens to sell books. It's a literacy program. It's a social support network. It's cultural programming. It's senior care and child development and small business mentorship all rolled into one." Margaret's eyes widened as she began to understand what they were suggesting. Catherine continued, "The problem is that you're trying to fund all of these community services through book sales alone, and that's simply not sustainable in today's economy. But what if we could help you create a model where the community services you provide are recognized and funded as the vital social programs they actually are?" "I don't understand," Margaret said honestly. William leaned forward, his enthusiasm evident. "What if we could help you establish the first Royal Community Literature Hub? A pilot program that combines traditional book selling with funded community services, educational programming, and social support initiatives?" Margaret's hands went to her throat. "Royal? You mean?" "We mean," Catherine said softly, "that we would like to become official patrons of what you're doing here, to help you expand it, and to use this as a model that could be replicated in communities across the UK and beyond." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret stared at them both, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were proposing. "But why?" she finally whispered. "I'm just an old woman who loves books." Catherine's eyes grew bright with emotion. "Mrs. Whitfield, Margaret, you're not just anything. Do you realize what you've accomplished here? In a world where communities are increasingly isolated, where people spend more time online than face-to-face, where children struggle to develop reading skills, and where elderly people face loneliness and isolation, you've created a space that addresses all of those challenges simultaneously." William nodded in agreement. "We've seen the statistics. Community isolation is a growing crisis. Literacy rates are declining. Small businesses are disappearing from high streets across the country. Mental health challenges are increasing, particularly among young people and seniors. You've created something that addresses all of these issues in one place." Margaret began to cry, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of recognition and validation. "I never thought of it that way," she said through her tears. "I just did what felt right." "That's exactly why it works," Catherine said, reaching across the table to take Margaret's hand. "You didn't create this place based on a business plan or a social services model. You created it from love and instinct and community need. That's why it's genuine, and that's why people are drawn to it." As if to emphasize Catherine's point, the door chimed softly, and Mr. Patterson, the elderly gentleman who attended poetry nights, peered inside hesitantly. "Margaret, dear, I hope I'm not intruding. I heard there was quite a commotion today, and I wanted to make sure you were all right." Margaret waved him in warmly. "James, please come in. I want you to meet some new friends." Mr. Patterson entered slowly, his walking stick tapping against the hardwood floor. When he realized who Margaret's new friends were, he stopped abruptly. "Oh my goodness. Your Royal Highnesses, I had no idea. Please don't let us disturb you," William said, standing to shake the older man's hand. "We understand you're a regular here." Mr. Patterson's face broke into a gentle smile. "Indeed I am. This place and Margaret's friendship have been my lifeline since my dear wife passed away 2 years ago. The poetry nights give me a reason to get dressed up and leave the house. The book discussions challenge my mind. And Margaret always remembers to ask about my grandchildren." Catherine gestured to an empty chair. "Would you mind joining us for a moment? We're learning about the role this bookstore plays in the community, and your perspective would be invaluable." For the next hour, Mr. Patterson shared stories that illuminated exactly why places like Chapters and Stories were so crucial. He talked about how the weekly poetry gatherings had become a support group for people dealing with grief and loneliness. He described how Margaret had connected him with other customers who shared his interests, creating new friendships that extended beyond the bookstore. "You see," he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, "this isn't just where I buy books. This is where I remember that I'm still part of something larger than myself." Margaret has created a place where it's safe to be vulnerable, where intellectual curiosity is celebrated, and where everyone is welcome regardless of their background or circumstances. William was taking detailed notes, clearly fascinated by the organic social support network that had developed around the bookstore. "Mr. Patterson, if you don't mind me asking, how many other places in your daily life offer this kind of community connection?" The older man considered the question carefully. "Honestly, none. The church I attended closed during the pandemic and never reopened. The community center was converted to flats last year. The local library has reduced hours and eliminated most of their programming. This bookstore is the last gathering place in our neighborhood that brings people together around shared interests and genuine human connection." The weight of that statement settled over the group. Margaret looked around her small shop with new eyes, beginning to understand the full scope of what she had created and what would be lost if it disappeared. Catherine's phone buzzed again, and this time she glanced at it with concern. "The story is really taking off online," she told William quietly. "But the coverage seems to be focusing on what we witnessed here today, not turning it into a spectacle." William looked at the screen over her shoulder, scrolling through social media posts and news articles that were already being published about their visit. The tone was overwhelmingly positive, with people sharing their own stories about beloved independent bookstores and the role they have played in their lives. "Look at this," Catherine said, showing them a tweet from a woman in Scotland. "Reading about the royal visit to that London bookstore made me realize how much I missed the little shop where I bought my first grown-up novel. Closed 5 years ago, and I still feel the loss." Another post read, "This is exactly what we need more of: royalty who understand that real community support happens at the grassroots level, one relationship at a time." Margaret read the posts with wonder. "People really care about these places?" "More than you know," William said. "We're seeing responses from across the UK and internationally. People are sharing photos of their own local bookstores, telling stories about shop owners who made a difference in their lives, calling for more support for independent businesses that serve as community hubs." Mr. Patterson chuckled softly. "Margaret, my dear, I think your little bookstore is about to become quite famous." But Margaret looked concerned rather than excited. "I don't want this place to change. I don't want it to become some sort of tourist destination that loses its heart." Catherine reached out to squeeze her hand reassuringly. "That's exactly why we want to work with you to do this right. The goal isn't to change what you've created here. It's to strengthen it, to ensure its survival, and to help other communities create similar spaces." William nodded in agreement. "We're talking about supporting what already exists, not transforming it into something different. The authenticity of what you've built is exactly what makes it valuable." As the evening deepened, their conversation grew more specific and practical. They discussed funding structures that would support Margaret's community programming without creating dependence on royal patronage. They explored partnerships with literacy organizations, publishing houses, and educational institutions that could provide resources and expertise while respecting the grassroots nature of what made the bookstore special. What we're envisioning, Catherine explained, is a model that could be adapted to different communities with different needs. A bookstore in a rural village might focus more on literacy programs for children, while one in an urban area might emphasize senior services or immigrant support. But they would all share the common elements of community building through books and literature. Margaret's excitement grew as she began to see the possibilities. We could create resource guides for people who want to start similar programs, training workshops for bookstore owners who want to expand their community role, maybe even a network where successful community literature hubs could support and mentor new ones. Exactly, Williams said. And by associating our names with the project, we can help secure the kind of institutional support and funding that individual bookstores could never access on their own. Mr. Patterson had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up with a question that went to the heart of the matter. Your Royal Highnesses, if you don't mind me asking, why this? Why bookstores? You could support any number of worthy causes. William and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke of shared understanding and deep conviction. Because Catherine said slowly, books and reading are fundamental to everything else we care about. Education, mental health, community connection, cultural preservation, empathy, and understanding between different groups of people. When you strengthen literacy and create spaces where people can explore ideas together, you strengthen the foundation of civil society itself, William added. And because what Margaret has created here represents the best of what communities can accomplish when someone cares enough to create space for human connection. This isn't about charity or top-down social programs. This is about recognizing and supporting the organic community building that happens when people are given a place to come together around shared interests. As the evening came to a close, the small bookstore felt transformed not in its physical appearance, but in its sense of possibility and purpose. What had begun as a quiet moment of compassion had evolved into the foundation for a movement that could touch communities across the nation and beyond. The quiet conversation that had started that morning was about to become something much larger, but it would remain rooted in the same values of authentic human connection and community care that had made Margaret's bookstore special in the first place. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chun stood in the same corner of the cafe where she had first witnessed the royal visit to Chapters and Stories. But the view across the street had transformed dramatically. The small bookstore that had been facing closure was now bustling with activity, but more importantly, it had become the catalyst for a movement that was spreading across the United Kingdom and capturing international attention. The changes had begun almost immediately after William and Catherine's visit. Within days, the story had been picked up by major news outlets, but rather than focusing on the celebrity aspect of the royal visit, the coverage had centered on the broader issues of community support, small business survival, and the vital role that independent bookstores play in building social connections. Margaret Whitfield had become an overnight symbol of grassroots community building, but she had handled the attention with the same grace and authenticity that had attracted the royal couple in the first place. She insisted that any media interviews take place in the bookstore during regular business hours, surrounded by her customers and the programs that had made the place special. This approach had the unexpected effect of showcasing not just Margaret's story, but the stories of the people whose lives had been touched by her work. The immediate practical results were remarkable. The landlord, suddenly facing intense public scrutiny and a wave of negative publicity about his plans to close the bookstore, had not only withdrawn his eviction notice, but had offered Margaret a new long-term lease at below-market rates. Local businesses had rallied to support their neighbor, creating an informal network of cross-promotion and mutual aid that was strengthening the entire commercial district. But the more significant changes were the ones that extended far beyond Kensington High Street. Within a week of the royal visit, William and Catherine had announced the establishment of the Royal Community Literature Initiative, a program designed to support and replicate the kind of community-centered approach that Margaret had pioneered. The announcement had been made not from a palace or formal setting, but from the bookstore itself, with Margaret standing beside them as an equal partner rather than a beneficiary. Sarah had covered that announcement as well, and she would never forget the moment when Catherine had said, "We're not here to save this bookstore. Mrs. Whitfield has already done that through decades of dedication and love. We're here to learn from what she's accomplished and to help other communities create similar spaces for connection and growth." The response had been immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of the program's announcement, over 300 independent bookstores across the UK had applied to participate in the pilot phase. Letters poured in from teachers, librarians, community organizers, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by Margaret's story and wanted to create similar programs in their own neighborhoods. But what truly amazed Sarah was how the initiative had evolved beyond anything anyone could have anticipated. The original plan had focused on bookstores, but the applications revealed that people were interested in creating community literature hubs in all kinds of spaces. A retired teacher in Wales wanted to establish one in an abandoned railway station. A group of university students in Scotland proposed converting a disused church into a community reading space. A women's shelter in Birmingham saw the model as a way to provide both literacy support and social connection for their residents. The international response had been equally surprising. Libraries in Canada were requesting information about adapting the model for their communities. A network of independent bookstores in Australia had announced plans to create their own version of the initiative. Publishers in several countries had begun reaching out to offer support and resources for community-based literacy programs. Sarah watched through the cafe window as the afternoon storytime session began at Chapters and Stories. The children's section that had once accommodated 15 or 20 children now overflowed with over 40 young participants, their parents, and caregivers filling every available space in the small store. Margaret had hired 2 part-time assistants to help manage the increased programming, but she still personally led the Saturday story sessions that had become a neighborhood institution. What struck Sarah most was how the essential character of the place remained unchanged despite its newfound fame. Margaret still knew every customer by name, still hand-selected book recommendations based on personal conversations about interests and needs, and still created an atmosphere where people felt safe to be vulnerable and authentic. The poetry nights had expanded from Thursday evenings to twice a week, not because Margaret had planned it that way, but because so many new participants had requested additional sessions. Mr. Patterson, the elderly gentleman who had become an unexpected spokesperson for the initiative, now helped facilitate the sessions and had even begun writing his own poetry for the first time in his life. The beautiful thing, Sarah had written in her latest article about the bookstore's transformation, is that success hasn't spoiled what made this place special. It has simply allowed more people to experience the magic that regular customers have known for years. The ripple effects had extended into areas that no one had anticipated. Local schools had begun bringing classes for weekly reading sessions, turning Margaret's bookstore into an extension of their literacy programs. The local council had started consulting with Margaret about community development projects, recognizing her expertise in bringing people together around shared interests. A nearby nursing home had established a partnership that brought elderly residents to the weekly book club meetings, creating intergenerational connections that benefited both the seniors and the younger participants. The local food bank had set up a satellite location in the bookstore's back room, operating on the principle that addressing hunger and supporting literacy were naturally connected community services. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her editor asking for an update on the story. She realized that what had started as a simple piece about a royal visit had become an ongoing documentation of how authentic leadership and community care could create change that extended far beyond anyone's original vision. Through the window, she could see Catherine arriving for what had become a weekly visit to check on the progress of various programs and to participate in the planning for new initiatives. There were no photographers this time, no formal announcements or press releases. Catherine simply parked across the street, walked into the bookstore, and joined the conversation like any other community volunteer. This approach had become characteristic of how William and Catherine had chosen to support the initiative they had helped launch. Rather than maintaining a formal distance or limiting their involvement to ceremonial appearances, they had become hands-on participants in the program's development. William had spent hours on phone calls with other independent bookstore owners, sharing what he had learned from Margaret about sustainable community programming. Catherine had visited dozens of potential community literature hubs, always accompanied by Margaret or another experienced community organizer who could provide practical guidance. The royal couple's authentic engagement had set a tone for the entire initiative that emphasized collaboration over hierarchy, learning over lecturing, and long-term relationship building over short-term publicity. This approach had attracted support from unexpected quarters, including business leaders, educators, and policymakers who were interested in the model's potential for addressing broader social challenges. Sarah had interviewed several of these supporters for her ongoing coverage of the story. A prominent CEO had told her, "What impressed me about this initiative wasn't the royal involvement, although that certainly helped bring attention to it. What impressed me was the authenticity of the approach and the clear evidence that it works. You can't fake the kind of community connection we've seen develop around these literature hubs." A university researcher studying social isolation had said, "What Margaret Whitfield created intuitively, we're now studying as a model for community-based mental health support." The combination of intellectual stimulation, regular social interaction, and meaningful contribution to community life addresses multiple risk factors for isolation and depression simultaneously. But perhaps the most powerful testament to the initiative's impact came from the participants themselves. Sarah had collected dozens of stories from people whose lives had been touched by the programs that had grown out of that original royal visit to chapters and stories. A single mother had written, "The children's reading program gave my daughter confidence in school, but it gave me something just as important, a community of other parents who understand the challenges I'm facing and who support each other through both celebration and difficulty." An unemployed teacher had shared, "Volunteering with the adult literacy program helped me maintain my skills and sense of purpose during a difficult period, but more than that, it connected me with people who reminded me why education matters and why my work has value." A teenager had explained, "The Young Writers Group gave me a place where being bookish and thoughtful isn't weird or uncool. I've found friends who share my interests and mentors who take my writing seriously." These individual stories multiplied across dozens of communities where community literature hubs had been established, creating a network of connection and support that extended far beyond what any single program could accomplish. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah watched the natural rhythm of activity in and around the bookstore. Customers browsed and chatted, children played in the expanded reading corner, volunteers prepared materials for evening programs, and neighbors stopped by simply to check in with Margaret and see what was happening. The scene was remarkable not because it was extraordinary, but because it was becoming ordinary. What had started as a crisis moment for a struggling bookstore had evolved into a sustainable model for community building that was being replicated and adapted across multiple communities. Sarah's final article in her series about the royal visit and its aftermath would focus on this transformation of the ordinary into the meaningful. She would write about how a quiet moment of compassion had demonstrated the power of authentic leadership to create change that extended far beyond any individual gesture or program. But most importantly, she would write about Margaret Whitfield, whose decades of dedication to her community had created the foundation for everything that followed. The royal visit had brought attention and resources, but it was Margaret's authentic care for her neighbors that had made the transformation possible and sustainable. As Sarah gathered her things to leave the cafe, she noticed a new sign in the bookstore window, Community Literature Hub Network Headquarters. Below it, in smaller text, "All welcome. Every story matters." She smiled, knowing that the quiet moment she had witnessed 3 weeks earlier would continue to ripple outward in ways that none of them could fully anticipate. In a world that often felt fragmented and disconnected, William and Catherine's spontaneous visit to a neighborhood bookstore had reminded an entire nation of the power of authentic human connection and the importance of the spaces and people who make such connections possible. The story that began with a struggling bookstore facing closure had become a testament to what could be accomplished when genuine care met genuine need, and when people with privilege and platform chose to use their influence to support rather than overshadow the grassroots work that was already making a difference in communities across the nation. Margaret Whitfield had saved her bookstore not through royal intervention, but through 4 decades of authentic community service that had created relationships strong enough to weather any crisis. The royal visit had simply helped the rest of the world recognize what her neighbors had known all along, that she had created something precious and irreplaceable, something worth fighting to preserve and worth working to replicate in communities everywhere.